What did you find out about your friend's sex life that actually shocked you? Story 1. Years ago, my insecure friend shared with us that he had finally lost his virginity to someone he described as incredibly attractive. We didn't believe him at first because he often exaggerated or made up stories like this, and they were always disproven. He was very focused on the fact that he was still a virgin at 24, and his biggest goal was to change that. It was clear that he wasn't in a healthy state of mind, and we did our best to boost his confidence and remind him that it didn't define his worth, but he struggled to accept that. He said that this time, he'd prove it to us so we'd know he wasn't making it up. One night, we were at the pub and he brought her along. She was a very attractive woman. We gently started asking about their relationship. She was surprisingly open and said she had been seeing him for 2 months and that he had stayed over at her place many times. Some of us wondered if maybe he had paid her to say that. They never kissed or acted romantic that evening. Eventually, though, we accepted it and felt happy for him. It seemed like he had finally achieved what he had been hoping for. We never saw the girl again, but that wasn't unusual, as we didn't often bring partners around our group. A few months later, I saw the same girl on the train. I casually asked how her boyfriend was doing, and she said he was doing well and had joined the Air Force. My friend was still living in town, so I asked, "What about my friend? Was that just a story that night?" She said no, he had visited her house many times, but the intimacy was only between her and her Air Force boyfriend, while my friend watched. She admitted she had a preference for scenarios that involved making men feel submissive, and I guess my friend thought it was better than nothing. I realized that the way she had phrased things that night was carefully vague, technically not untrue. I never told anyone, and I never brought it up to him. A few months later, they broke up, and even years later, he still occasionally brings up stories about their time together. I just go along with it and keep a secret. Story 2. A friend of mine came out as a shul. I had never met anyone who identified that way, so I asked him a lot of questions, always within what he was comfortable sharing, about what that meant and what his relationships were like. He explained that he simply doesn't have a desire for intimacy, doesn't find anything appealing about it, and doesn't want to be involved in it. He said that although he has experienced it before, he's felt this way his entire life. He has been with his girlfriend for over 5 years. She is not a shawal. She is involved with other people, and he's completely okay with it. He has no desire to change the structure of their relationship, and she's currently fine with that as well. His biggest concern is how his family would react if they knew. He worries they'd assume he was just hiding something else, like a different identity. It turns out that even people who don't experience attraction can still fear judgment from others. Story 3. One of my former best friends and his fiancée had been together for nearly 5 years and were due to get married in a few months when this happened. They were very open about their relationship, often saying their intimacy was amazing and that they were active nearly every night. A few months before the wedding, she confided in me that they had actually never been intimate before because he was afraid. Apparently, he had her pretend they were regularly intimate, so it would seem like everything was normal. During the first couple of years, they had tried to be together but never got anywhere. After that, he simply lost interest in her. She also revealed that the emotional abuse in the relationship had been quite severe, something she had completely hidden from everyone to protect him. This experience is the reason why he is now a former best friend. Story 4. My best friend married his high school sweetheart. I knew they were both waiting until marriage. What I didn't know, and only found out when they eventually divorced, was that they had only been intimate about 20 times during their entire 10-year marriage. His wife evidently got no enjoyment from it and only agreed when she wanted to have children. They had 3 kids, all conceived fairly quickly. He wasn't allowed by her to engage in any kind of solo activity or view any adult content, though he occasionally did so privately. This had nothing to do with religion or personal beliefs, just her own perspective on intimacy. My friend, not knowing any better, assumed that's what marriage was supposed to be like. He's now remarried to an incredible woman who genuinely enjoys a healthy relationship and has been more than willing to make up for all the time he spent in what was essentially a closeted, affectionless marriage. I've never seen him this happy. Story 5. I have a friend I've known since childhood. Among our group of nerdy, awkward guys, this friend was always the most confident when it came to dating. Last winter, this friend came out as bi, which was surprising to the group since we had always perceived them as the most conventionally heterosexual of us all. 2 months later, they came out as a woman, which was an even bigger surprise. At the time, we were working at the same company and spent a lot of time driving around together. I used those moments to ask her questions, and she was very open to the conversation. What I gathered from our talks was that she preferred being in the more submissive role in intimate situations and didn't feel particularly attached to certain parts of her anatomy. She even mentioned that if her body changed and she no longer had those parts, she'd be completely fine with it. It was difficult for me to fully understand at first, but eventually, our whole friend group adjusted without any trouble. We now call her by her new name, and she seems genuinely happy. I'm glad she feels comfortable and fulfilled being her true self. Story 6. She confided in me that she had been the victim of an extremely violent assault as a teenager, so severe that even the authorities were reportedly shaken by the level of brutality involved. Since then, she has developed a recurring and overwhelming fantasy rooted in that trauma. Over time, fulfilling this fantasy has become increasingly difficult, as the scenarios she imagines have grown more intense, and many people are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of participating in something so extreme, even as roleplay. It has reached a point where she has put herself in genuinely dangerous situations, going into unsafe areas in hopes of recreating what she experienced. It's heartbreaking. Hearing anyone express a desire to relive that kind of pain is difficult, but knowing her personally, how gentle and kind she is, it makes the entire situation even more shocking. If you knew her the way I do, it would truly leave you speechless. Story 7. This one still haunts me, and I honestly wish I never knew it. My close friend Frank, someone I've known for over 15 years, shared a story with me that's darker than anything I could have imagined. His father, by all accounts, was a deeply disturbed man. Over the years, Frank's father committed horrible acts, the kind that are hard to even believe someone could do, especially since he still walks free in society. The worst part? He harmed his own children, not just Frank's sisters, but Frank himself. Being a victim from such a young age shaped Frank's life in tragic ways. He's a big guy, but extremely persuasive and charismatic. He lacks a clear sense of morality, especially when it comes to relationships. Frank has been with more people than I could count, and he's known for using a simple but surprisingly effective pickup line on dating apps. Want to come over? His recklessness has led him into all kinds of situations, but nothing prepared me for what he told me one day. He admitted to having crossed a boundary with one of his sisters. That moment has never stopped bothering me. The things I've learned about his family, the trauma, the darkness. I truly wish I didn't know as much as I do. Story 8. Back in high school, I was friends with a girl who seemed like the sweetest person you could ever meet. Let's call her Kari. She had strawberry blonde hair, bright blue eyes, stood barely 5 feet tall, and was totally obsessed with choir music and fantasy books. Everyone thought she was harmless and adorable. During senior year, we had a falling out. Kari was close friends with another girl who had a quiet crush on me. I was vaguely aware of it, but nothing was ever said directly, and I ended up dating someone else who had been clear about his interest in me. Kari was furious. She said I wasn't patient enough for her friend, and then began to act out in surprisingly cruel ways, spreading rumors, ignoring me in group settings, making passive-aggressive posts online. It was shocking to see that side of her. Eventually, I realized the sweet, quirky persona might have been more for show than substance. 2 months before graduation, her best friend, after smoking a lot, called me for a ride home. I was always the go-to designated driver, especially after losing family in a tragic accident. On the way, she let something slip. Carrie had a very specific private interest. She enjoyed wearing diapers, using them, and then engaging in private behavior involving that. I was stunned. She even mentioned there were online profiles on niche forums tied to Carrie's fanfiction username. Despite how unkind Carrie had been to me, I didn't tell anyone. I read maybe 2 sentences of one of those posts and immediately knew how humiliating it would be if that got out. As much as she had hurt me, no one deserves to be publicly shamed for something that private. To this day, Carrie probably remembers me as the one who didn't date her friend. What she'll never know is that I was the one who could have exposed her and chose not to. Story 9. We weren't close friends, but my wife and I once met a couple at a furniture warehouse sale. There's this high-end furniture store in our city that has a massive annual sale with markdowns up to 70%, and every year it draws big crowds. My wife and I arrived about 90 minutes early, and 5 people were already ahead of us. The first 3 were together, and the next 2 were a couple from a small town a few hours away. They were in their early 30s and had brought a pickup and trailer to buy a lot. We made small talk while waiting, and after the doors opened, we all went our separate ways. A week later, while at the mall for dinner, my wife and I decided to walk through Barnes & Noble and ran into that same couple. While the women chatted, I asked the guy if they were in town shopping again. He replied no and mentioned they were attending an event. I asked what kind, and he simply said, "It's an adult gathering." I immediately understood what he meant and just wished him a good time. Later, I told my wife they were likely swingers and shared what the event was about. She didn't believe me until we got home and looked it up online. This was back before smartphones, so we had to use the computer. Needless to say, it was one of the more unexpected follow-up meetings we've ever had. Story 10. There was a guy who lived on my dorm floor during freshman year who was obsessed with telling everyone how many people he had been with. He claimed his body count was 11, and all he ever talked about was joining a fraternity and how popular he supposedly was with girls. We all had doubts thinking he might be making it up, but we let it slide. After winter break, he came into my room to catch up with me and my roommates. Eventually, the conversation shifted, and someone asked him what his number was now. He paused and said he couldn't remember if it was 13 or 14. That raised some red flags, so we gently pushed further. We asked how he couldn't remember something like that so recently. To our surprise, he sighed and said, "You know what? Forget it. I trust you guys. I've never even kissed a girl." We were stunned. It was hard to know what to say. We felt bad for prying and told him it was okay, and that we'd support him however we could. We're now 4 weeks into our sophomore year, and he still hasn't had his first kiss, but we're rooting for him. Story 11. I've been friends with a group of 5 guys since childhood. Some of us met as early as kindergarten. We stuck together through middle school, high school, and into adulthood. My closest friend, let's call him Robert, has always had incredible luck with women. Seriously, better than James Bond. Another one of our friends, Nathan, once broke up with his girlfriend after finding out she had been unfaithful. The situation got even messier when she told him that after hooking up with Robert allegedly told her he had also been with Nathan's mom, who, by the way, was a very attractive single parent. Robert completely denied the claim. Given that Nathan's ex had a reputation for stirring drama, we believed him. That was back in our senior year of high school. Fast forward about 7 years. We're all sitting around drinking and catching up. Everyone except Nathan, who had moved out of state. I made a joke and said, "I still can't believe Nathan's ex said you slept with his mom." Robert got quiet and started biting his finger nervously. One of the guys blurted out, "Wait, did you?" And without hesitation, Robert nodded and said, "Yeah, I did." We all freaked out, throwing questions at him. From what we gathered, it was a one-time thing, arranged in advance, and it got, well, very explicit. We made a pact never to tell Nathan, for obvious reasons. Story 12. My ex-wife and I were staying at her aunt and uncle's vacation home in the mountains. We didn't have much money at the time, and her relatives, whom I jokingly called her fairy godparents, were extremely wealthy and very active in their church community. She sang in the choir, and he was involved in church finances. As a wedding gift, they let us spend time at their mansion in the Smoky Mountains. Out of sheer curiosity, and maybe poor judgment, I started going through the bathroom drawers and cabinets in the house. Anyone who's ever done this sort of thing knows how to return everything exactly as they found it. But in the master bathroom, I noticed one drawer didn't close quite right afterward. Just a slight resistance, like something was off. So I took a photo of the drawer's contents, removed it carefully, and found something unexpected. A small plastic nozzle peeking out from behind the plumbing area. This was in the bottom drawer to the left of the sink. There were also short drawers above it, seemingly designed to avoid hitting the plumbing. Curious, I removed those too and discovered an enema bulb and a large bottle of warming lubricant. Now, I have no issue with what people do in private, but what struck me was how hidden everything was. That storage space behind the plumbing wasn't visible unless you removed drawers, something no one would typically do. I'd also never seen a cabinet set up like this, with short drawers in the middle where doors would usually go. A few days later, we were invited to lunch by some nearby vacation homeowners. Their place had a similar layout and design, so I used the opportunity to ask for a tour, mostly because I wanted to see if their bathroom had the same odd drawer setup. It didn't. Their master bathroom had standard cabinet doors under the sink, just like any typical home. I never told my ex-wife what I found. I actually played bass in the church band behind her aunt, and I still think they were brilliant. If they did design that bathroom layout specifically to discreetly store personal items, it was done with impressive precision. Had that enema bulb landed an inch differently, I never would have discovered it. This story isn't just about appearances versus reality. It's about how cleverly someone can design a space to balance privacy and convenience, even in a vacation home that's frequently shared with guests. And honestly, if you're going to keep personal items discreetly tucked away, that setup was about as subtle and well-planned as it gets. Story 13. My best friend is a truly beautiful and intelligent woman. We studied together from high school all the way through graduation. Every guy who met her seemed to develop a crush, including some of the people in our close friend group. She eventually became a high school teacher, and unsurprisingly, even some of her students admired her. But honestly, it's her personality that draws people in, more than just her looks. She's warm, kind, and effortlessly charming. 2 years ago, at the age of 33, she married a wonderful man she had been in love with for about a year. Here's the part that completely surprised me. Just 1 week before her wedding, she asked me how to have intercourse. I was stunned to find out she was a virgin. We've always been close enough to talk about our personal lives, even about intimacy. But it suddenly hit me that she had never actually talked about her own experiences, only about others or mine. She wasn't conservative or someone who had made a vow to wait until marriage. Somehow it had just never happened for her, and I was the only person she felt comfortable enough to ask without hesitation. Story 14. This is probably the most surprising thing I've ever been trusted with. One of my very close friends has always come to me and my wife for relationship advice, but sometimes she comes to just me for more personal matters. She really cares about what my wife thinks of her and doesn't want to be judged. Though honestly, my wife would love her no matter what. Anyway, this time she came to me with a concern about her current boyfriend. She confessed that she enjoys filming herself and her partner during their intimate moments. Not for money or anything like that, but purely because she finds it thrilling. The issue was that she was starting to worry her boyfriend wasn't truly into it and was only going along with it to make her happy. She then shared that during one of their sessions, her boyfriend asked her to try something new. He wanted her to take a more dominant role in a very specific way. She agreed and, surprisingly, found that she actually enjoyed it. Things took a turn when she later discovered, accidentally, that her boyfriend had been filming himself alone without telling her. This led her to believe he might be hiding something about his identity. She suspected he could be gay. She wasn't upset about the possibility, but she did start to question the foundation of their relationship. She felt that by staying with him, she might be preventing him from living as his true self. I advised her to talk to him as soon as possible, because bottling it up would only make things worse. A few weeks later, my wife and I found out they had decided to stay together. He came out as bi, and they began openly exploring new experiences together, including group encounters they now share online. My wife was totally unfazed and just wished they had looped her in earlier. What shocked me wasn't what they were doing. It was the fact that I was the one trusted with such deeply personal details. Being confided in like that meant a lot. It reminded me how fascinating people are, how love takes so many different forms, and how much of a privilege it is to be trusted with someone's truth. Story 15. I used to work with a very quiet, modest woman who dressed quite conservatively. Think more like someone twice her age. We didn't have much in common in terms of interests, but she was kind, so we often took our lunch breaks together. She had a slight Southern accent and was very involved in her church community. She would often talk about her struggles with dating and how hard it was to find the right person. She was about 25 at the time, and as she had mentioned, still a virgin, possibly due to her religious background. One day during lunch, she was upset about a date that didn't work out. I tried to comfort her and casually asked what she was looking for in a partner. That's when the conversation took a very unexpected turn. For the next 20 minutes, she shared in the most polite, calm tone imaginable, Southern accent and all, that she was deeply interested in a 24/7, dominant, submissive lifestyle. not just as something in the bedroom, but as a full-time way of living. She talked about the websites she used to meet people and how she envisioned marriage within that dynamic. I was stunned. She got quite detailed, which I was definitely not prepared for. Later that night, out of pure curiosity, I found her profile online, complete with photos. It really drove home the idea that you never truly know what someone's into. I left that job a few months later for a new opportunity, and we never spoke again. I did hear she eventually got married. Part of me has always wondered if she found exactly what she was looking for. Story 16. Back in high school, I had a close friend who came from a very strict religious background. Her family were Jehovah's Witnesses. Because of that, we mostly talked at school or occasionally online. There was definitely some chemistry between us, but given her situation, we never acted on it. During our senior year, I knew for certain that she had never kissed anyone. She told me directly, and I believed her. One afternoon, she asked if I could stop by her house to pick up materials for a school project. She wasn't allowed to get her license yet, but said it was fine with her mom since it was school-related. I showed up and everything seemed normal. She answered the door in jeans and a hoodie, invited me in, and said her family was out for the day. That surprised me, but I didn't think much of it. She told me to sit while she grabbed the project supplies from her room. She came back with them, but instead of handing them to me, she gently pushed me back onto the couch, sat on my lap and unzipped her hoodie, to reveal she had nothing underneath. We ended up fooling around, and she gave me my first experience with that kind of intimacy. It was also her first kiss, first everything. She wanted to take things further, but we were both inexperienced and I hesitated. Looking back, maybe it was for the best, but it was a moment I'll never forget. Story 17. My friends and I were at an outdoor social event and we needed to stream a program on a TV. The antenna wasn't working, so my straight friend, let's call him M, offered to log into his YouTube TV account using my phone. It worked perfectly, and the event went on without a hitch. Later that night, my phone started blowing up with email notifications. I was confused until I realized that when M signed into his account, it synced his Gmail with my phone. I didn't notice at the time and started opening emails out of habit. One of the first messages I saw was between M and another man, whom we'll call Chad. In the message, M asked if Chad's wife would be joining them. Chad replied no, and then described in very explicit terms how he intended to be far more satisfying than his wife could ever be. I was stunned. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but after thinking it through, I decided I would never bring it up. It doesn't change how I see him, and we're part of a very close-knit friend group. Saying something might damage that dynamic. Whatever his preferences are, that's his business. Honestly, if he found happiness or connection in that moment, then good for him. Story 18. While working away from home, I boarded with a really kind family. We quickly became good friends. They had a 2-year-old, and the mother hadn't had a single day off since the child was born. The kid was your typical, terrible 2, but honestly, he never gave me any trouble at all. One evening during supper, the mother mentioned how badly she needed a break. Half joking, I offered to watch their kid for the weekend so they could spend a couple of days at a nearby resort. To my surprise, the dad jumped on the idea and eventually convinced the mom. That Friday, right after I finished work, they packed up and left for their mini vacation. Everything went smoothly. The little guy was great the entire time, except for one moment. I was reviewing a ski lift wiring diagram when I suddenly realized how quiet the house had gotten. Too quiet, a chill went through me. I called out his name, nothing. I called louder. Then I heard him running down the hallway yelling, "Touché, touché!" like he was a knight in battle. And in his hand, the biggest adult toy I've ever seen in my life, waving it around like a sword. I froze. He looked at my face and bolted down the hall. I didn't even chase him. I just yelled, "Put that back where you found it." Then it hit me. What if he didn't? What if his parents got home and assumed I'd been snooping through their private things? I waited until they returned and we all sat down for dinner. The mom asked how the weekend went. I figured I'd better just come clean. I told them everything. The dad and I were in tears from laughing, food going everywhere. The mom was mortified at first, but quickly saw the humor in it and joined us. In the end, it became one of those stories we'd all laugh about for years. Story 19. I went to meet up with my best friend, who was having a drink with a female friend he occasionally hooked up with. We were all laughing and having a great time. At one point, he asked if he could borrow her bike for an upcoming trip. Without missing a beat, she replied, "Well, you still haven't returned that strap-on you borrowed last year. But you know what? You can keep it." I thought she was joking until I saw his face. He went completely quiet, avoided eye contact, and looked more than a little annoyed. Then he quickly changed the subject. I considered saying something supportive like, "Who cares, man? Do what makes you happy. Nothing wrong with that." But it was clear he wasn't ready to joke about it or even talk about it at all. What surprised me most was that he's usually the one making judgmental or outdated comments when these kinds of things come up. I had always assumed it was just ignorance, but maybe it was a form of deflection, hiding something personal behind uncomfortable humor. The truth is, there's nothing wrong with liking what you like, as long as it's legal and consensual. But it's not okay to shame others just because you're afraid to be open yourself. Maybe someday I'll bring it up again, in a respectful way. Maybe even ask him how it went. But something tells me he's not quite ready to, no pun intended, open up. Story 20. My best friend, let's call him Jerry, and I have a mutual friend from high school named Liz. Liz was always quiet and reserved, the kind of person who kept to herself, but had a brilliant mind. She was incredibly talented in music and graduated as valedictorian. While most of us were out socializing, she preferred reading or playing instruments alone. We hadn't heard from Liz in years. One day, Jerry and his wife were out at a restaurant when they unexpectedly ran into Liz and her husband. They walked over to say hello. Jerry and his wife had never met the man before, so Liz introduced them. But then things got surprising. The very first thing this guy says is that he and Liz are very active in the swingers community. Without missing a beat, he asked Jerry and his wife if they're happy in their marriage. They responded yes, but he kept going, insisting they would be even happier if they tried swinging. It wasn't a casual comment. It felt more like a hard sell. You will enjoy this more than your monogamous life. Understandably, Jerry felt uncomfortable, especially since he and his wife were newlyweds at the time. He politely ended the conversation, and that was the last he ever spoke to Liz. Years later, we found out that both Liz and her husband had changed their names and were beginning their gender transitions. It's wild how people can transform in ways you never expect. But that meeting still sticks with Jerry as one of the strangest, most unexpected reunions of his life. Story 21. I used to work with this petite woman, barely 5 feet tall, mid-40s at the time, while I was in my mid-20s. She and I were great co-workers, always in sync, and we treated each other like best work buddies. But one conversation I had with her will stick in my memory forever. One day she was clearly in a mood. You could see it all over her face. I finally asked her what was wrong, and she told me that her daughter had just broken up with her boyfriend because he had cheated. She seemed genuinely upset, which I understood, until she added, he was so good in bed too. I froze. I think I dropped whatever I was holding. I asked her what she meant, thinking I must have misheard, but she repeated it. Then she explained that she had a kind of test for any guy she thought was worth her daughter dating. She would sleep with them first. She told me this calmly, like it was perfectly normal. Apparently, her daughter was fine with it. Maybe that was just the way she was raised. I tried to make a joke, saying something like, "Well, you're definitely a dedicated mom." And she nodded with complete sincerity. Inside, I was stunned. A few months later, I saw her again, this time with her daughter and a new guy. She introduced him casually, and all I could think was, oh no. It took everything in me not to intervene or say something. In some ways, the whole thing is just deeply unsettling. In others, I suppose it's her life, her rules. Still, I can't forget that moment or how casually she dropped that bombshell. It's just one of those truths you wish you didn't know. Story 22. The first time I met the woman who would become my first girlfriend, she casually told me she wanted to have an experience involving Slender Man and tentacles. It was 2012, so that kind of internet culture was everywhere. She's easily one of the most adventurous people I've ever known, which is saying a lot. These days, we have more of a friends with benefits dynamic, and even after all these years, she still finds ways to surprise me. Recently, she asked me to buy her one of those alien egg-themed toys. I got it for her, but I'll admit, she finally found something I wasn't personally into, which is impressive given how open-minded I've always been. Another ex was into some specific interests that weren't really for me, things like water sports and diaper play. One of the most awkward moments in that relationship was standing in the store, buying diapers with her. I did try one of her requests once, but it wasn't something we repeated. She was still open and supportive of my own more fantasy-based preferences, so I appreciated that balance. Back in high school, I knew a girl who looked much younger than her age, so much so that people dropped their guard around her. She used that to her advantage. In reality, she was a highly manipulative and controlling person with intense and dark tendencies. She was into domination and pain, and the contrast between how she appeared and what she enjoyed made it all the more unsettling. She later became a mom at 20 after admitting she hadn't used protection during a hookup. I never expected her to be careless, considering how calculating she usually was. Then there's my sister, who's had numerous relationships with married men, many of whom had no idea what was going on. She finds the whole situation funny, which says a lot about her personality. Lastly, I dated someone whose most intense fantasy involved a very specific type of anime-inspired scene. As wild as her ideas were, she was kind, thoughtful, and more genuinely loving than anyone I had ever dated. Even though she didn't believe in romantic attachments, she showed more affection than most people who do. Story 23. This wasn't exactly a friend story, but it's one I'll never forget. We were doing a surprise inspection at a military dorm early one Saturday morning, around 5 a.m. During the check, we found a woman in one of the mail rooms. She turned out to be the wife of another service member. According to regulations, we had to take her into custody and notify her husband to come pick her up. My personal life has always been relatively quiet, but I've somehow always ended up a witness to the strangest situations. I once walked in on a group event happening in a dorm. Another time, I left town briefly and returned to hear from my roommate that a woman had been with 3 guys at a party. The next day, the police contacted me for questioning. Turns out, after the party, the woman had demanded payment, or she'd accused the men of assault. It came to light she had done this before and was working part-time in that line of work. When her husband came to the station, the officers were prepared for a confrontation. He was a large man, so they even had extra personnel and a K-9 unit on standby. But when he arrived, he walked in calmly, went right up to his wife and said, "Honey, are these cops hassling you?" It left everyone speechless. I remember thinking, maybe he was into situations like that. It was such an unexpected reaction. One more moment that stands out. I have a friend who's brilliant. She's a doctor, a published writer, and a regular newspaper columnist. Highly intelligent, articulate, and thoughtful. One day she mentioned her dream of having a 3-way with 2 male bodybuilders. I wasn't one of them, but knowing her, it probably happened. People really do contain multitudes. Story 24. I had a really good friend whose fiancé was in the Marines. After he left for service, she started spending a lot of time with my roommates and their group of friends. It wasn't long before she and one of my roommates were getting a little too close, which made me uncomfortable. Another friend and I brought it up to her, and she swore nothing was going on. We didn't fully believe her, but we tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I had a trip planned to Napa for 3 days, but we ended up coming home a day early without telling anyone. When I walked in, I heard someone having S in the apartment. I laughed it off and started unpacking. Then I stepped outside for a cigarette, and there she was. Her hair was a mess, and the look on her face said it all. She tried to say it wasn't what it looked like, but it obviously was. That was it for me. I cut ties with her and the roommate completely. I didn't know her fiancé well, and I didn't have any way to reach out. No social media, nothing. But if I'd had the chance, I would have told him without hesitation. No one deserves to be betrayed like that, especially not someone serving their country. I can only hope either she told him the truth or he never finds out. Trust is something people take for granted until it's gone. Story 25. This memory still blows my mind. I'm not religious, but I went to a Christian school growing up and kept in touch with a few people from that time. One of them was a girl named Tammy. We were in our early 20s and very close. Tammy was the definition of a devoted Christian. She led Sunday school, dressed modestly, never cursed or drank, worked at a non-profit store for people with disabilities, and lived with her parents. Church was her life, or so I thought. One night we were sitting in her car, and I asked how she was. She said she needed prayer. I asked what was wrong, expecting maybe stress or anxiety. But instead, she opened up for the first time in 5 years and told me she had been in a dominant, submissive relationship with a much older man, someone she'd met as a teenager. Twice a week, she'd visit him at his auto repair shop, where he kept a separate apartment just for their sessions. She had never told anyone. I think she confided in me because I was always open-minded and never judged anyone's experiences. I wasn't shocked by the kink itself, but the fact that she, of all people, had kept something like that hidden for so long. She genuinely still believes in her faith and sees what she's doing as a sin, but something she hasn't been able to stop. Strangely, she would still refuse to sleep with any of her boyfriends, but this secret relationship she allowed. It didn't scandalize me, but it did make my brain feel like it had to reboot. You never truly know what someone's carrying beneath the surface. Story 26. I dated a woman for 2 years. Our relationship was solid, but our intimacy was limited. Very reserved, nothing adventurous. She didn't like trying anything outside of a few specific things, and everything else was either weird, painful, or just off limits. She was very conservative in that part of her life. We broke up on good terms, though we lost touch for several years. About 5 or 6 years later, she reached out. She said I was the only person she could talk to about what she was going through. She told me that after we broke up, she fell into financial trouble and became a S-worker to pay off her debts. She told me everything, what she'd learned to enjoy, stories about her regular clients, the online profiles she had, even some of the pictures she'd taken. She had also been in therapy due to a manipulative client she had developed feelings for, which turned into a toxic, emotionally abusive situation. The contrast between the woman I dated and who she had become fascinated me. We started talking more, even hanging out again. There was a clear spark, and she started flirting. I was in a relationship at the time, and though part of me was tempted, I stepped back. I knew chasing that storybook wild reconnection would never replace what I already had. We drifted apart again, and I haven't heard from her since. But from what I last heard, she paid off her debts and left that part of her life behind. I truly hope she's okay. Story 27. I'm keeping this vague just in case anyone I know happens to stumble across it. I went to high school in a small, deeply religious town where no one really talked openly about relationships or anything remotely intimate. One day I was late for class and saw a girl, let's call her T, crying by the drinking fountain. Naturally, I stopped and asked if she was okay, and eventually ended up walking her to the bathroom so she could clean up and calm down. She clearly needed someone to talk to because she opened up more than I ever expected. She started telling me about her much older boyfriend and how they had been doing everything, from every position to things I hadn't even heard of at the time. But that wasn't the part that really caught me off guard. The problem was they weren't trying not to get pregnant, not because they wanted to be parents, but because he had a thing for pregnant women. She said it was his fetish. Keep in mind, this was in a town where even basic health class discussions were considered taboo, so I was both overwhelmed and unsure how to respond. I tried to be supportive but couldn't help pointing out that the consequence of that fetish was, well, an actual child. She brushed it off like it was something that would have happened eventually anyway. So why not now? It was such a strange, emotional moment. I didn't mean any harm, but being a high schooler, I told a few friends about what happened, more in a you won't believe this kind of way than out of judgment. Unfortunately, word got around. By the end of the school year, junior year, I think, she was pregnant. I felt terrible, especially thinking I may have had something to do with how quickly it spread. Her parents ended up pulling her out of school and relocating her. I never heard from her again. I hope she's okay. I still think about that day and how important it is to protect someone's trust when they open up like that. Story 28. I have a buddy who's an ex-military sniper and now works as a firearms instructor. Over time, his professional work evolved into an online presence. He shares lessons, talks about guns, military life, and has built a strong community on social media. He's been married 3 times, and the reason each marriage ended is identical: cheating. Every time he ended up getting involved with much younger women he met through that very same online gun community. He once showed me the kind of messages he gets, and it was wild. He's an average-looking guy, nothing flashy, but women, mostly 18 and up, are all over him. Some are military or former military, others are just civilian gun enthusiasts. These women aren't shy either. I read one message from a 19-year-old who said she wanted to fly out to his state, book a motel, and spend the weekend with him, knowing full well he was married at the time. He gets messages like that all the time. Some even coordinate hookups during their reserve duty near his area. It's constant. His last wife left him after finding out he was having a fling with two women in their early 20s. Yes, at the same time, and yes, in their shower. She confirmed all of it through a mutual friend. He always came across as the serious, career-focused type, and I had assumed his divorces were because of that. Turns out I was completely wrong. He told me this is surprisingly common among people in his line of work, and that sometimes women project admiration or unresolved issues onto men in uniform. He also added that it works both ways. Plenty of guys send similar messages to female instructors too. I just couldn't believe how different he turned out to be from the image I had in my head. Part of me wanted to say, if you're going to live like that, fine, but stop pretending you want commitment. Story 29. My friend used to wear a key around his neck, just an ordinary key on a lanyard, but he constantly bragged to everyone that it was for a S club he was a member of. We were teenagers at the time and didn't know enough to press him seriously about it. Anytime I asked for more details, he'd suddenly get quiet, his whole expression would shift, and he'd just shut down the conversation. Eventually, I started to assume he was probably making it up for attention. Years later, I met someone who actually was part of the same club, and I finally got the full story. Turns out it wasn't a S club in the traditional sense. It was a private group where men would voluntarily be locked in cages and subjected to various kinds of physical play. Shock collars, squirt bottles, smacks from different objects. From what I understood, no actual intimacy occurred at the club itself. It was more about control and discomfort as a kind of intense foreplay or fetish experience. And it was expensive. I suppose everyone has different preferences and needs when it comes to expression and identity. But calling it a S club was definitely misleading. It gave a very different impression from what it really was. Story 30. Back in high school, a buddy and I were chatting with a female friend. She had the kind of sweet and innocent demeanor that made everything she said sound surprising. She was one of the smallest in our class physically, and she had a boyfriend at the time. Out of nowhere, she told us about the first time they were intimate, and how, without warning or consent, he switched to something more painful and unexpected. She described the experience in detail and said it had caused her a lot of pain. We didn't know how to react. We laughed. It was a horrible, immature response, and it still makes me cringe thinking about it. At the time, we didn't realize how serious it was. Looking back, it was clear that what happened to her was a violation. It was wrong, and we should have recognized that immediately. Later, she and her boyfriend broke up, and she and I ended up getting closer. Eventually, we became a couple. She told me that relationship had made her feel invisible, like her needs didn't matter. In our relationship, things were completely different. We explored intimacy with respect and care, and it turned into something healing for her. Even when we revisited that previous trauma together, she felt supported. While certain things weren't for her, I was glad she felt safe enough to trust again. Story 31. Right after high school, I shared an apartment with a coworker who also worked at his family's business. He was intelligent, but a little quiet and withdrawn. He had a whole collection of snakes and lizards and mostly kept to himself. He didn't date, and while I sometimes wondered, I figured he was just shy or hadn't come out yet. Then one evening I came home to find him crying. After half an hour, he admitted his pet gecko had died. What came next shook me. He told me he had killed it during a S-act. I froze. Suddenly, everything I'd ignored made sense. All the reptiles that seemed to disappear. His growing obsession with dragons. I had no idea what exactly he had done, and honestly, I didn't want to know. But I knew enough to understand it wasn't okay. I told him he needed help, that maybe he was struggling with intrusive thoughts, and that talking to a professional would be the right step. I didn't confront him any further, but I made a quiet plan to move out. By the end of the month, I had left the apartment and quit working at his family's company. I never told anyone about what he confessed. Years passed. Then one day I was outside a store and saw his dad. We exchanged a brief hello. Later, I looked my old roommate up online out of curiosity. He had changed his name and had completely reinvented himself. In his latest photos, he was wearing a tail and had a girlfriend who also dressed up like a dragon. I just hope he's found peace, and that he's no longer hurting any animals. Story 32. Our friend group was a tight circle, 6 guys and 6 girls. One couple in the group had been together forever, and the rest of us were all pretty close. We'd hang out most Friday nights, drink, laugh, and just have fun. Over time, a few casual hookups happened among the rest of us, but nothing serious ever came of it. We were all open about most things, relationships, life. But that one couple always kept things more private. We assumed it was because they had it all figured out and were just really happy together. One weekend, we all went to a cabin near a lake for a relaxing trip. The vibe was laid back, and as the drinks flowed, the conversation got deeper about relationships, and life in general. To our surprise, the usually reserved couple joined in, and then came the bombshell. They were into Group S and had been swingers for years. They said they'd always been afraid we'd judge them or cut them out of the group if we found out. But we didn't. In fact, we laughed, and one of the other girls casually admitted she found the idea exciting. Given that some of us had already hooked up in the past, it didn't feel like that far of a leap. And, well, one thing led to another. Within 30 minutes, the entire cabin turned into a free-spirited, full-blown group experience. Every room was occupied. People switched partners, and the energy was wild. You'd think the next morning would have been awkward, but it was the opposite. Everyone was relaxed. We had the most peaceful, cheerful breakfast ever. People were cuddling, and some were just walking around nude like it was the most natural thing in the world. After that, it became a tradition. Every year, we'd go back to that cabin for a weekend, just like that one. Some people even broke up with their partners just for that weekend because they knew exactly what it meant. It's strange how one night changed the dynamic of our entire group, but it brought us closer in a way none of us could have predicted. Story 33. I had this friend who I thought was completely out of my league. He was funny, confident, and seriously attractive. We're both gay, and although I had a bit of a crush on him, I never thought anything would actually happen. My daydreams were nothing wild, just basic intimacy, maybe a kiss, something soft and affectionate. We'd been friends for about a year when we both went to a house party with a group of friends. That night, we got completely blackout drunk. By the time the party had quieted down, everyone was asleep except for the two of us. One thing led to another, and he started messing around with me. It was nothing too wild at that point, just playful and spontaneous. I was on cloud 9. A few days later, we arranged to hang out again at his place. That's when things took a turn I wasn't expecting. He revealed that he was deeply into master-slave dynamics, BDM, and specifically puppy play. I had never heard of it before. We were both only 18, and I was stunned by how far into this world he already was. During intimacy, he would wear full puppy gear and only communicate through barks or whimpers. When not in character, he wanted to be the master, taking on a completely different role. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't judge him, I still don't, but I was taken aback. I couldn't understand how someone so composed, charming, and yes, gorgeous, could be so deeply involved in something so niche at such a young age. That was the only time anything ever happened between us. We've stayed in touch loosely over the years, but we never went back to that moment. Still, I don't regret it. If anything, it broadened my understanding of how diverse people's desires can be. It was unexpected, but definitely eye-opening. Story 34. When I first became friends with her, she very quickly opened up to me about everything. Specifically, she started telling me extremely detailed stories about her romantic experiences. Each week, it seemed like there was someone new. She'd tell me who she had been with, where it happened, never in conventional places like a bed or couch, and exactly what went on. The positions she described were ones I'd never even heard of before. She'd go into detail about what her partner's expressions looked like, the kind of things they used together, and even the sounds she made. I tried to be supportive, if not just slightly overwhelmed. Once, she accidentally sent me a photo that was far more than I ever needed, or wanted to see. To this day, that image is burned into my memory. She also told me about having group experiences and once invited me and my boyfriend to join in. I politely declined. Despite all this, she's still my best friend. She's hilarious, thoughtful, and genuinely a great person. Honestly, if she stopped being so open, I'd probably wonder if something was wrong. One thing worth noting, though, is that despite being so open herself, she can get quite jealous. She's been upset with guys for being in relationships before even getting to know her, which adds an interesting layer to her personality. Story 35. About 2.5 years ago, when I was 19, I had a close friend who was 18 at the time and already married. She and her husband, who was 21, were living in a small apartment with their 1-year-old daughter. Their relationship was pretty rocky, and there were constant arguments, so I ended up staying over most of the time for about 4 months to help take care of the baby. It was a stressful and chaotic situation, but I stayed because their daughter clearly needed someone stable in her life. As young friends do, we'd sometimes sit around and joke about our past. Some stories were light, others more personal. One day the topic turned to relationships and intimacy, and they decided to show me their drawer of toys. It was packed with items I didn't even know they had the time or privacy to use. We were all sleeping in a one-room studio, so I had no idea when any of it was happening. It left me concerned, honestly, especially with a child so close by. Eventually, my friend confided in me that her husband was struggling with his identity. She told me he had experimented with a male friend, cross-dressed in private, and was most comfortable being the more submissive one in their relationship. She didn't mind being more dominant and tried to support him at the time, even when their roles reversed. Later, during one of their many breakups, he told her he was transgender and went through what she described as a breakdown. There was a moment she mentioned that deeply disturbed her. During a desperate attempt to win her back, he behaved inappropriately in front of their daughter during an emotional outburst. That moment seemed to be a turning point. In the months that followed, she told me that intimacy between them had completely shifted. She was no longer interested or attracted to him, especially because their entire intimate life had become centered around his specific preferences, and it no longer felt mutual. He became irritable and difficult when his needs weren't met, and she grew more distant and emotionally detached. Eventually, she saved up enough money to leave. She took their daughter and later their newborn son with her. We lost touch not long after, and I don't know where he is or what he's doing now. But I do know she's not with him anymore, and that was probably for the best. Their relationship was filled with constant arguments, reconciliations, and emotional turbulence. Every time I thought I had heard the wildest part, another story would surface. It was truly one of the most chaotic relationships I've ever witnessed up close. Story 36. Back when I was 20, I had a roommate named Celia who had just moved in with her boyfriend Leo. They'd been together about a year, but it was already clear to me they had no business living under the same roof. Leo was charismatic but moody, one of those people who could be charming one minute and emotionally icy the next. Celia, meanwhile, was the type who always gave people too many chances. At first, I thought it was just typical relationship friction. Then during one of our late-night talks, she told me Leo didn't want to be touched unless it was on his terms. He didn't like kissing, refused to cuddle, and hated being asked to be emotionally present. But strangely, he expected her to participate in very specific role-play scenarios. Celia told me he had a fixation on being treated like a doll, like completely passive. He wanted to be dressed up, talked to, and used without any expectation to respond. It wasn't really the kink that shocked me. It was how controlling he was about everything. He'd sulk for days if she didn't go along with it. He wouldn't yell, he'd just ice her out completely. She was so desperate to keep him happy that she started rearranging her schedule just to be available whenever he wanted these sessions. It all escalated one night when I walked in on them in the living room. I didn't know they were home. Celia was talking to him in a soft, strange voice, and he was just lying there motionless, dressed in women's clothing, with his eyes closed. I quietly backed out and never mentioned it. A few weeks later, she broke down and told me he hadn't spoken to her in 3 days because she didn't treat him like a proper object during their last encounter. She started crying, saying she didn't even know what a normal relationship looked like anymore. She moved out a month later. I don't know if she ever told anyone else what went on, but she left a note on the kitchen counter that just said, "I want to be a person again." Story 37. I used to work with a woman named Alyssa in a bakery. She was in her early 30s, quiet, and always wore a wedding ring, though I never heard her talk much about her husband. We worked together for a year before she finally opened up to me during a really slow closing shift. She said that when she and her husband first got together, he was sweet, generous, and made her feel safe. But within the first year of marriage, everything changed. He started insisting she refer to him as sir, even outside the bedroom. She laughed it off at first, thinking it was just a phase, but it became mandatory. He began keeping a journal, her journal, where he tracked her behavior. If she didn't complete chores exactly how he wanted, he'd write in it like a teacher grading a student. She once got marked down for using her phone too much while folding laundry. She said she tried to leave once, but he hid her car keys and stood in front of the door until she apologized. The next morning, he bought her flowers. When I asked why she didn't just pack a bag and go to a friend's, she told me she didn't have any left. He'd made sure of that. Little by little, he'd driven wedges between her and everyone she loved. Eventually, she started leaving tiny notes in the bakery storage room. I didn't realize it until I found one taped under the shelf that read, "I'm still here." One day, she didn't show up to work. 2 days passed. I called, texted, nothing. A week later, she walked in during my morning shift, bags under her eyes, and handed me a cupcake box. Inside were her wedding ring and that same notebook he used to grade her. She never came back to work after that, but every time I bake now, I think of her, and I hope she's somewhere quiet, where she doesn't have to ask permission to be herself. Story 38. My cousin Lily and I were born 6 months apart and were close growing up. She was the type of person who always wanted more from life. More attention, more excitement, more validation. When she was 22, she started dating a guy named Evan, who was soft-spoken, artsy, and really into astrology. He seemed harmless, a bit too spiritual for my taste, but she was head over heels. At first, she loved his sensitivity. He'd write her poems, draw her weird sketches of their souls entwined, and talk endlessly about their past lives. Then things started to shift. Evan became obsessed with the idea that Lily was his mirror flame, which apparently is more intense than a twin flame. He claimed that meant they had to go through cycles of separation and pain to evolve spiritually. So he started orchestrating fights on purpose. Real fights. Mean, emotionally manipulative ones. He'd scream at her, call her selfish, then disappear for 3 days without warning. When he came back, he'd say it was all part of their energetic karma and that she should be grateful they were growing. She started losing weight, quitting hobbies, and one day confessed to me that she hadn't gone out with her friends in over 4 months. She wasn't allowed to, Evan said, because external energies messed with their bond. She finally left him after he locked her out of their apartment for 12 hours to help her transcend attachment. She came to stay with me for a while. One night over wine, she said, "It's weird. He never hit me, never cheated, never even raised his hand. But I've never felt so broken in my life." She's in therapy now, dating someone new, and slowly rediscovering who she is. And I learned that not all abuse leaves bruises. Some of it just rearranges who you are until you don't recognize yourself anymore. Story 39. When I was 21, I moved in with an old friend named Maya. We'd known each other since high school, and when we reconnected, she was newly single and said she needed someone steady around. At first, things were chill. We'd watch Netflix, cook dinners together, go out on weekends. But not even a month into living together, I started noticing signs that she wasn't really as single as she claimed. She'd get random late-night texts and disappear into her room. One night, I walked in from the kitchen to find her throwing a huge stack of mail into the trash. Mail addressed to someone named Ryan. I didn't ask questions, but things kept piling up. Her mood would swing violently depending on the day. Some days she'd be glowing, cheerful, talkative. Other days, she wouldn't come out of her room at all. Eventually, she told me the truth. Ryan was her ex, but they never really broke up. He had a girlfriend, someone else entirely, and he'd bounce back and forth between them. Maya had convinced herself that they were soulmates, that the other girl was just a distraction, and that someday he'd choose her for real. He would show up unannounced, spend the night, and vanish the next day. Sometimes he'd leave bruises, not from hitting her, but from grabbing too hard during fights or moments when she tried to stop him from leaving. She always brushed it off, saying it was just the way they were. One morning, I woke up to the sound of her sobbing in the bathroom. She was sitting on the floor, mascara smeared all over her face, holding a necklace he had given her back in high school. I asked what happened, and she finally admitted that he had gotten the other girl pregnant. He told Maya it was a mistake, but he was going to try to be a good dad. Maya spiraled after that. For weeks, she barely ate, stopped going to work, and would sit by the window waiting for his car to pull up. It never did. I stayed as long as I could, but eventually I had to leave for my own sanity. Before I moved out, I wrote her a letter. I told her she deserved better, that love isn't supposed to feel like begging for scraps, and that real soulmates don't treat you like a backup plan.